She took a job one else dared touch, in a Hell's Angels salvage yard, and what unfolded next left everyone who witnessed it completely speechless. You actually want to work here? Nobody survives a week. Clay Walker's voice sliced across the scrapyard like cold iron, and Amber Collins didn't so much as flinch. $40 in her pocket, a single backpack on her shoulder, a husband with a team of lawyers hunting her across 3 states. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "I'm not nobody." Amber Collins hadn't slept in a real bed for 3 straight nights. The first night she'd curled into a plastic chair at a bus terminal in Ohio, trying to make herself invisible beneath the fluorescent hum of ceiling lights that never went dark. The second night, she'd found refuge in a back booth at a diner where a soft-hearted waitress let her nurse a single cup of coffee for 6 hours without asking her to leave. The third night, she'd returned to what had become her only constant, the front seat of her 14-year-old Honda, cracked windshield, an amber check engine light that had burned for 200 miles, and the unbroken silence of a shuttered hardware store parking lot where she'd hidden it behind a rusting dumpster. She'd curled her knees to her chest and stared at her phone until the battery went dark, because every time she allowed her eyes to close, she saw Nathan's name lighting up the screen again. 14 missed calls, then 31, somewhere in the middle of Indiana. She'd stopped counting entirely. She was 28 years old, and over the preceding 4 years, she had learned with brutal clarity that fear came into distinct varieties. There was the fear of a man's hands, a physical thing, immediate and undeniable, which she had experienced exactly twice, and never a third time, because the second occasion had sent her out the door that same night with nothing but a duffel bag and a decision carved permanently into her bones. And then there was the other kind of fear, the quieter one, the kind that left no marks on your skin, the fear of paperwork arriving without warning, bank accounts frozen overnight, a private investigator's sedan parked outside her sister's house in Columbus for 4 consecutive days, until her sister called her weeping, begging her to just come back, just talk to him, just make it stop. That was Nathan Mercer's preferred instrument. He didn't need his hands. He had money, and money accomplished things hands never could. So when Amber crossed the state line into a town she'd selected almost at random, small, isolated, 300 miles from anywhere Nathan's name carried weight, a dot on a gas station map on a highway she'd never before heard of. She wasn't searching for comfort. She was searching for the one corner of the world a man like Nathan Mercer would never think to look. She found it by accident, or by something that felt uncomfortably like fate. If she allowed herself to believe in things like that. Driving past a chain-link fence that stretched for half a mile, crowned with rust and warning signs, she spotted a hand-painted board nailed crookedly to a post. Steel Haven Salvage Help Wanted. Serious inquiries only. Beneath it, in smaller letters scrawled by a different hand, "Don't bother if you can't handle hard work." Amber sat in her car outside that gate for 11 minutes. She watched men move through the yard, large men, tattooed arms, leather vests stitched with patches. The low growl of motorcycle engines rolled in and out like a tide she couldn't predict. She'd heard of the Hell's Angels the way most people had, through news segments, second-hand stories, cinematic mythology, all of it designed to make a person's stomach tighten and their feet move in the opposite direction. But then she thought about smart. She thought about how smart she had been for 4 years. Married to a man who wore a $3,000 suit to church every Sunday, who opened doors for her in front of company and slammed them in her face when the audience disappeared. She thought about how being smart hadn't saved her. Being smart had nearly gotten her smothered alive by the slow, suffocating patience of a man who called ownership love. Nathan Mercer would never in 100 lifetimes picture his ex-wife walking through a gate like this one. That was reason enough. She climbed out of the car before her own hesitation could talk her back into it, smoothed down a blouse that hadn't seen a washing machine in 4 days, and walked toward that gate like she already belonged on the other side of it. A man built like a commercial refrigerator stopped her before she'd covered 20 feet. arms folded across his chest, sunglasses on an overcast morning, a patch on his vest that reads Sergeant at Arms. "Help you with something?" I saw the sign. Her voice came out steadier than her heartbeat. The job posting, the man. She'd learned his name was Deacon. Looked her over the way you'd size up a stray dog that had wandered onto your property. Assessing, not hostile, just measuring whether it bit. "You sure about that?" "I need work," Amber said. "I don't scare easy." Deacon almost laughed. "Almost. Everybody says that. Wait here." He disappeared into the maze of stacked car frames and compressed metal, and Amber stood at that gate for what felt like an hour, but was closer to 10 minutes. Heart hammering, hands cold in the summer heat, every nerve in her body screaming that she'd made a catastrophic mistake, that she should climb back into her car and drive until the tank ran empty. She didn't move. When Deacon returned, he wasn't alone. The man walking beside him differently from everyone else in the yard. Not faster, not louder, but with a gravitational quality that made the space around him feel immediately smaller. He was perhaps 55, with a grey beard trimmed close and neat, grey hair pulled back beneath a bandana, and forearms wrapped in tattoos that had faded into the skin old maps. His vest carried one patch that read President, and beneath it, a single word, iron. Clay Walker had run Steel Haven Salvage for 11 years. He had run the local charter of the Hells Angels for nearly 20. And in that time, he had developed something his brothers respected more than almost anything else about him. He could look at a person for exactly 4 seconds and know, with unsettling accuracy, whether they were lying. He looked at Amber for 4 seconds. "You're not from around here," he said. Not a question. "No, sir." Running from something. Amber's throat tightened. She'd rehearsed this conversation across hundreds of highway miles. Careful half-truths, palatable deflections, the kind of practice performance she'd learned to deliver in order to keep the peace with a man who rewrote reality when the truth inconvenienced him. Standing in front of Clay Walker, none of it surfaced. "Yes," she said instead. Something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, but it was there. "In trouble with the law?" "No, in trouble with a man." The question hit harder than she expected. Her jaw tightened. "Yes." Clay nodded slowly, the way a man nods when information confirms something he already suspected. He glanced at Deacon, a silent exchange Amber couldn't follow, then brought his eyes back to her. "You really want to work here? Nobody lasts a week." "I'm not nobody," Amber said. For a long moment, no one spoke. The yard's noise seemed to recede around them, the distant clang of metal, the testing groan of a revved engine, voices she couldn't see. Clay studied her the way he'd studied thousands of salvaged parts across -1 years, searching for the hidden flaw that would tell him whether something was worth keeping all ready for the scrap pile. "We've burned through -1 people in 2 weeks, he said finally. "Filthy work, dangerous work. Most walk by Wednesday." "I won't. You can't know that. I know I don't have anywhere else to go." And for the first time, her voice cracked, just barely, just enough. "So I'm not going to quit the only thing I've got." Clay was quiet for a long breath. Behind him, a younger biker, lean, maybe 30, tattoos climbing his neck, leaned against a stripped truck frame, watching the exchange with open curiosity. "Paperwork," Clay said at last. Amber blinked. "What?" "We've got records going back 15 years. Vehicle logs, salvage titles, disposal reports. Half of it hasn't been touched since the man who ran it retired. It's boring, dusty, doesn't pay much better than floor work, and it's not going to impress anybody." "I don't need to impress anybody," Amber said. "I need to work." Clay extended his hand, not to shake hers, but pointing toward a crooked office trailer sitting on cinder blocks near the front of the yard. "Then go make yourself useful. Trailers unlocked. Filing cabinets are a disaster. You last till Friday. We'll talk about making it permanent, boss." Deacon's voice carried a quiet warning note. "You sure?" Clay didn't answer him. His eyes stayed on Amber. "Friday. That's the only promise I'm making." Amber gripped her backpack strap until her knuckles went white. Friday, she agreed. She didn't know, walking through that trailer door for the first time, that she had just stepped into the single most consequential decision of her life, not only for herself, but for every person standing in that yard. The inside of the trailer smelled like mildew and decades of deliberate neglect. Amber stood in the doorway, taking in what could only be described as chaos, given the shape of a room. Filing cabinets lined 3 walls, their drawers hanging open like broken jaws, yellowed paper cascading from every gap. A desk sat completely buried beneath boxes. The single window was so thoroughly caked with grime that the afternoon light passed through it the color of weak tea. Nobody had told her where to start. Nobody had explained what organizing 15 years of abandoned paperwork actually meant. She was alone in a trailer that predated her high school graduation, inside a scrapyard run by men who could probably crush her with one hand, 300 miles from anyone who knew her name. She almost laughed. It was either that or cry, and she had wept enough in the last 4 years to last several lifetimes. So she rolled up her sleeves, found a broom hiding behind a stack of tires, and started moving. The first 2 hours were pure survival, clearing a path, uncovering surfaces, discovering that the desk drawer stuck because a family of mice had constructed an elaborate nest inside a folder labeled 2009 intake. She didn't scream. She sighed, set the folder aside, and kept moving. Around 4 in the afternoon, the door creaked open. A woman close to Amber's age stepped inside, holding 2 bottles of water. Short dark hair, a Steel Haven t-shirt with grease stains riding up both sleeves. "You're either genuinely brave or you've lost your mind entirely," the woman said, setting one bottle on the least buried corner of the desk. "I'm Rosa. I run the front counter when we actually have customers who need one." Amber: "Yeah, I heard." Rosa leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, surveying the wreckage with something close to sympathy. "Clay mentioned Friday. He mentioned it. He tells everyone about Friday. Honestly, it's not really about Friday. It's about whether you're still standing Thursday night." Rosa's eyes tracked down to Amber's hands, already raw from paper cuts and dust. "Want some advice?" "Sure. Stop trying to impress anyone. These guys have seen every type walk through that gate. Cops going undercover, girlfriends trying to prove a point, college kids who think a biker's scrapyard sounds like a wild summer adventure. They can smell performed toughness from a mile out." She paused. "Just do the work. That's the whole test." Amber looked at the disaster surrounding her. "That's a lot of work. 15 years of nobody caring is a lot of work." "Yeah." Rosa pushed off the door frame. "Holler if you need anything." Then she paused, something more serious crossing her face. "Whatever you're running from, these are good men. Rough around every possible edge, but good. You're safer here than you think." She left before Amber could respond. Amber stood there holding that sentence, like something fragile. Safer here than you think. She wanted badly to believe it, but 4 years with Nathan Mercer had taught her that safety was a word people used in the exact moment before it evaporated. She got back to work. By the end of that first day, she had cleared 1 filing cabinet, and then she found something that made her stop breathing, buried deep inside a folder marked simply, "MISC do not file." She discovered a stack of vehicle titles that didn't correspond to any intake records she'd encountered so far. 9 vehicles, all processed through the yard within the same 3-month window 2 years earlier, all missing the chain of custody documentation that state law required. It wasn't necessarily sinister on its own. Record keeping this catastrophic could explain almost anything, but something about the pattern nagged at her, the repetition, the consistency of the gaps. She didn't say anything, not yet. She'd learned in her marriage that flagging problems before you understood who benefited from them could be extraordinarily dangerous. So she placed the folder in a separate pile. She'd mentally labeled questions and kept working. Clay came by around 6, as the light outside had turned orange and the shadows stretched long across the yard. He stood in the doorway and took in the transformed corner of the trailer. 3 organized stacks where chaos had reigned. A cleared path to the desk, the beginning of something resembling a system. You didn't quit, he said. It's been 1 day. I thought most people quit by hour 3. He nodded toward the questions pile. What's that? Amber hesitated. Then, because something about his directness made deception feel pointless, she told him. 9 vehicles from about 2 years back. No chain of custody documentation. Could be nothing. Could be someone just forgot to file the paperwork. Clay's expression didn't shift, but his eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. The look of a man recalculating something. You've been here 1 day, and you found that. I used to do bookkeeping, Amber said. Not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she'd spent 2 years managing the financial records of Nathan's real estate holding company before he decided a wife's purpose was to be decorative rather than employed. In that time she'd developed a precise, instinctive eye for the kind of small inconsistency that, left unaddressed, became a catastrophic problem. Numbers that don't add up bother me. Clay studied her for another long moment. Keep that pile separate, he said finally. Don't mention it to anyone else yet. Why? Because I want to know who's been in and out of this trailer for the past 2 years before I know what you found. And for the first time, something crossed his face that looked almost like respect. Good work today. He left before she could respond. Amber sat alone in the fading light, feeling something she hadn't experienced in longer than she could reconstruct. Useful, not managed, not owned. Useful on her own terms. She didn't know that night. Driving her rattling Honda to the cheap, clean, no questions asked motel Rosa had recommended that the folder marked MISC do not file would end up at the center of everything about to happen. She only knew that for the first time in 4 years. She slept 8 unbroken hours without waking up in a panic. Friday came and went. Nobody mentioned it again. By the end of her 2nd week, Amber had transformed the trailer from a controlled catastrophe into something that actually resembled a functioning filing system, color-coded folders, a rebuilt intake log, a cross-reference system she'd constructed entirely by hand because the yard's ancient computer could barely run a word processor without threatening to collapse. She had also quietly compiled a list of 43 discrepancies spanning 15 years of records, ranging from minor clerical oversights to the kind of pattern that, in her previous life, would have triggered an internal audit and a very uncomfortable conference call. She hadn't shown anyone the full list yet. Clay had told her to sit on it, and something in his tone made clear that wasn't a suggestion. What she'd noticed in those 2 weeks was something else entirely. The yard itself, and the men who ran it, were nothing like what she'd expected. Walking through that gate, she'd anticipated menace. What she found was a rough, deliberately unpolished kind of decency that caught her off guard every single day. There was Big Sam, who could bench press a small vehicle and who spent every lunch break on the phone with his 11-year-old daughter, his voice going soft and patient in a way that seemed physically impossible given the scale of his hands. There was Deacon, who had assessed her so coldly at the gate, whom she later found sitting in his truck after hours, quietly walking a teenager from town through a job application because the kid's father was incarcerated, and there was no one else willing to teach him how. There was Rosa, sharp-tongued and quick to laugh, who mentioned once almost in passing that the club had paid her mother's chemotherapy costs 2 years ago when the insurance company denied the claim. No questions asked, no interest charged, nothing expected in return except that she keep showing up. And there was Clay Walker, who said perhaps 20 words to Amber on any given day, who never inquired about the messages she sometimes flinched away from on her phone, who never pushed for details she hadn't volunteered, but who had, on her 3rd day, quietly mentioned that the club kept a lawyer on retainer, in case she ever needed to know that. Why are you telling me this? She'd asked. Because you've got the look of someone who thinks she's completely alone, Clay said, and you're not. She hadn't known what to do with that. She still didn't most days, but slowly, carefully, she was beginning to let herself consider the possibility that it might be true. The messages from Nathan had not stopped. If anything, they had gotten worse. Where are you? You can't disappear from me forever. Amber, I've got people looking. It's only a matter of time. You know exactly how this ends. It always ends with you coming back. She'd stopped responding weeks ago, back before she'd even reached this town. But Nathan didn't require responses to maintain a conversation with himself. He spoke like a man entirely certain the universe would eventually rearrange itself back into the shape he preferred. What frightened her most wasn't the messages themselves. It was that they kept arriving at all. Because despite the new SIM card, despite every precaution she'd taken, her number was somehow still reaching him, or reaching someone who reached him. She hadn't shared the full picture with anyone at Steel Haven. Not the specifics. Not Nathan's money, his connections, the private investigator her sister had mentioned who had, according to a phone call made from a payphone 3 weeks ago, photographed the Honda's license plate outside a gas station in Kentucky. She'd given Clay only the barest outline. A bad marriage. A man who didn't understand the word no. A need to vanish. It was Rosa who noticed first that something had shifted. You've been checking that phone like it's about to attack you, Rosa said one afternoon, leaning in the doorway with a sandwich in one hand. Everything okay? Amber set the phone face down on the desk, a reflex she'd developed without realizing it. Fine. You know that's not a real answer. It's the only one I've got right now. Rosa didn't push, but her eyes lingered a moment longer than casual conversation required. The particular look of a person filing something away for later. That evening, walking to her car across the gravel lot, Amber noticed a black sedan parked across the street that had not been there that morning. Nondescript, tinted windows. The exact kind of vehicle engineered to be forgettable. Her stomach dropped through the ground. She got into the Honda quickly, hands already shaking on the steering wheel, and drove 3 different directions before doubling back toward the motel, watching her mirrors every mile. By the time she parked, her heartbeat had climbed so high she could feel it in her throat. The sedan was gone. It might have been nothing. Someone waiting for a friend. A real estate agent between showings. 100 completely harmless explanations existed. But Amber had spent 4 years with Nathan Mercer, learning that the harmless explanation was almost never the correct one. She didn't sleep that night. The following Monday, Clay found her in the trailer before the yard had fully awakened, before the first engines had begun their morning growl. You look terrible, he said, which from Clay was less an insult than a clinical observation. Didn't sleep much. He studied her for a long moment. That same 4-second read he'd given her the first day, except this time it stretched longer, more deliberate. Somebody following you. Amber's breath caught. Why would you ask that? Because Deacon clocked a black sedan sitting on Route 9 3 times over the weekend. Different plates each time, which means someone's rotating vehicles, which means someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Clay's voice was flat, the way a man discusses whether he's already prepared for. You going to tell me who you're actually running from, or keep pretending it's nothing? Amber's hands trembled slightly as she set down the folder she'd been holding. 4 years of trained instinct told her to deflect, to minimize, to protect the secret the way Nathan had conditioned her to protect everything about their marriage, the arguments nobody witnessed, the apologies that came with conditions attached, the slow, patient erosion of every friend and family member who might have noticed something wrong. But she was so tired of carrying it alone. His name is Nathan Mercer, she said quietly. My ex-husband. Real estate money. Inherited and made, both. He spent the last 5 months trying to locate me. Lawyers, a private investigator. He froze accounts I didn't even know he could access. My sister told me a man has been watching her house. Clay's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. He hurt you. Amber's silence answered more clearly than words could have. How many times? Twice, she said. The second time I left that same night. Clay nodded slowly, processing the information with the same methodical quietness he brought to everything. No visible reaction, no judgment, just careful, thorough absorption. He know you're here. In this town. I don't think that's so. I've been careful. New phone. Cash only. I haven't touched a card in 6 weeks. She hesitated. But the messages keep coming. Somehow he's still reaching me. Show me. She unlocked her phone with shaking fingers and handed it over. Clay scrolled through the messages in silence, his expression unreadable, though something in the set of his shoulders had gone rigid. This isn't a man searching for his wife, he said finally, returning the phone. This is a man who believes he owns something that got away from him. That's exactly what it is, Amber whispered. Clay was quiet for a long moment, and Amber watched something shift behind his eyes. A decision being made, weighed, finalized. You're not going anywhere, he said. Not because of him. Clay, I don't want to bring trouble to this place. You've all done more for me than I ever. I didn't ask what you wanted, Clay interrupted, not unkindly, but with a firmness that stopped her mid-sentence. I'm telling you how this is going to go. You keep coming to work. You keep doing what you've been doing. And if that sedan appears on Route 9 again, my brothers are going to know exactly what it means, and exactly what to do about it. Something cracked open in Amber's chest. Not fear this time. Something closer to disbelief. The vertiginous shock of being protected by someone who had nothing to gain from it. Why would you do that for me? She asked. You barely know me. Clay considered the question with the same seriousness he brought to everything. 2 weeks ago, you walked through that gate with $40 and a backpack, running from a man with more money than sense. And you didn't ask for pity. You asked for work. You found 9 fraud cases buried in a filing cabinet nobody had touched in 5 years, and instead of broadcasting it, you came straight to me first. He paused. In my experience, that tells me everything that matters about a person. Amber didn't trust her voice. She just nodded, blinking back something hot behind her eyes that she refused to let fall. Get back to work, Clay said, his voice softer now. Unlock your car doors from now on. Every time. He left, and Amber sat alone in the trailer staring at the mountain of paperwork still waiting for her, and feeling, for the first time in years, not safety exactly, not yet, but the first real flicker of it. Over the following days, something in the yard's atmosphere shifted. Though nobody announced it, Deacon began parking his motorcycle near the front gate during Amber's shift hours, ostensibly working on a rebuild that never seemed to advance. Big Sam took to walking her to her car at the end of each day, chatting about his daughter's soccer league and his mother's recipes, while his eyes swept the street with the practiced casualness of a man who had performed this kind of quiet protection before. Rosa began texting each morning to confirm Amber had arrived safely. Nobody made it theatrical. Nobody gathered her in a meeting and declared themselves her protectors. They simply did it, the way they seemed to do most things, without asking for recognition, without waiting for gratitude. The black sedan didn't return, but something else did. A letter arrived at the yard's general business address, addressed simply to the management of Steel Haven Salvage. Clay opened it in his office on a Wednesday afternoon, and Amber, passing with an armful of files, saw his expression change in a way she'd never witnessed before. Not anger exactly, something colder and more focused. What is it? She asked, stopping in the doorway. Clay held the letter up, without a word. It was from a law firm she recognized instantly, the same firm Nathan's family had retained for 2 decades. Dense with legal language, it alleged that Steel Haven Salvage was knowingly harboring a woman in violation of a legally binding financial agreement, and warned that continued association could expose the business to significant liability. It was, Amber realized with a sick lurch, the opening move of a war she'd never wanted to bring to anyone else's doorstep. He knows, she whispered. He knows I'm here. Maybe, Clay said, setting the letter down with deliberate calm. Or maybe he's guessing, sending letters like this to every scrapyard, every diner, every gas station within 300 miles of your last known location, hoping one of them panics and gives you up. What if it's not a guess? Clay looked at her, and for the first time Amber saw something in his expression that wasn't reassurance. It was resolve, cold and absolute. Then he's about to learn, Clay said, that this club doesn't scare, and it sure as hell doesn't fold. He slid the letter into a drawer, looked back up at her, and his expression made clear the conversation was over. Get back to work, Amber. But Amber couldn't move, not yet, because standing in that cramped little office, watching a man who owed her nothing decide, without hesitation, to plant himself between her and a threat that had already cost her everything once, she understood something she'd stopped believing was possible. She might have found somewhere to belong, somewhere that wouldn't ask her to disappear, to keep the peace. She didn't know yet how far Nathan Mercer was willing to go. She didn't know the black sedan had only been the beginning, or that the letter in Clay's drawer was nothing compared to what would arrive at Steel Haven's gate in the weeks to come. She only knew that for the first time in 4 years. The people surrounding her didn't make her feel like something to be managed. They made her feel like someone worth fighting for, 40 miles away, in an office with a view that cost more than most people's homes. Nathan Mercer set down his phone, looked at the private investigator sitting across from him, and said the words that would set everything in motion. I found her. Nathan Mercer never raised his voice. That was the detail people who didn't know him always got wrong. They expected a man with his money and his name pressed into half the buildings downtown to bark commands, to pound mahogany. Instead, he leaned back into his leather chair, laced his fingers together, and said it again, softer the second time, almost tender. I found her. The private investigator, a wiry, hollow-eyed man named Grissom, who had built a career finding people who had committed themselves entirely to not being found, cleared his throat. We've got a probable location, not confirmed yet, a scrapyard outside of town. The kind of place that barely shows up on a map. It runs under a motorcycle club charter, Hell's Angels. Something moved briefly across Nathan's face. They're and gone. Bikers, he said. Yes, sir. She's hiding behind bikers. Nathan rose and moved to the window, looking out over a city that had made him wealthy twice, once through inheritance, once through his own hands, and he had never allowed anyone to forget, which he considered more significant. Send the letter to the business, see how they respond. Men like that collapse the moment lawyers get involved. They don't have the stomach for paperwork. He turned back from the window, and for just a moment, the carefully maintained mask slipped, revealing something underneath that was considerably colder. And if they don't collapse, he said, then we remind them exactly who they're dealing with. Back at Steel Haven, Amber didn't sleep that night either. She lay on the thin motel mattress staring at the water-stained ceiling, replaying Clay's words on a loop. This club doesn't scare, and it sure as hell doesn't fold. Trying to let them settle into something that resembled comfort. They didn't quite manage it. Comfort had become a foreign language to her, one she recognized the shape of, but no longer spoke fluently. At 5 in the morning, unable to stay still any longer, she showered in water that never reached truly hot, and drove to the yard before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. She told herself she only wanted to get ahead on the filing. The truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. She didn't want to be alone with her thoughts in a room with a lock that looked like a determined child could defeat it. At that hour, the yard belonged to almost no one. A single motorcycle sat near the front gate. Deacon's. She recognized the custom paint job. When she pulled in, he was already awake, sitting on an overturned crate with a gas station coffee, watching the road like it owed him something. You're early, he said, not looking surprised. Couldn't sleep. Yeah. He took a slow sip. Figured you might not. After yesterday. Amber hesitated beside her car door. Were you out here all night? Somebody should be. The simplicity of it. No speech. No ceremony. Just a man drinking terrible coffee at 5 in the morning because he had decided without being asked that she was worth losing sleep over. Hit Amber somewhere she hadn't been prepared for. She had to look away. You don't have to do that, she managed. Finally, I know. Deacon set his cup down. He was doing it anyway. She let herself into the trailer, without another word. Because if she stayed in that conversation another 30 seconds, she was going to cry in front of a man she'd known for 2.5 weeks. And she had promised herself driving into this town that she was done letting people see her fall apart, except some quiet, unfamiliar part of her whispered that Deacon wasn't the kind of man who would use it against her. The work consumed her the way it always did, a mercy, really. The way dates and case files and paper trails could swallow a mind that would otherwise spiral without traction. But it was the 9th folder she pulled that morning, thin, easy to miss, tucked behind a stack of scrap steel receipts, that made her stop breathing for a full 3 seconds. Vehicle registration transfers, 6 of them, all processed within the same month 2 years ago, all bearing a county inspector's signature she recognized from earlier discrepancies. Same inspector, same irregular pattern of missing documentation. But this time something new had surfaced, a secondary signature, a smaller, pressed into the lower corner of each form, a notary stamp, which, when she looked closer, carried an expiration date that predated every single transfer by 11 months. The notary seal had expired before it was ever used. Amber sat back slowly. Her pulse began to climb. This wasn't sloppy record keeping anymore. Sloppy record keeping didn't deploy an expired notary seal consistently across 6 separate transactions, timed to coincide with a specific inspector's signature. This was deliberate construction. Someone had been laundering vehicles through Steel Haven Salvage, through the yard's legitimate name, the yard's paperwork, the yard's established credibility. Without the yard's knowledge, her hands trembled as she photographed each document, cross-referencing dates against the intake logs she'd rebuilt from scratch. 6 vehicles, all high value before salvage, all processed by the same inspector, all disappearing from official records within days of their paperwork being filed. She found Clay in the main garage bay, elbow deep in a pickup engine, and she didn't wait for an opening. "I need you to see something." He looked up, registered her face, and immediately wiped his hands on a rag hanging from his belt. "It's not what I thought before," Amber said. "It's not clerical errors." She held out her phone, photographs of the documents arranged in a gallery. "Someone has been using this yard's paperwork to launder stolen vehicles. Same inspector, expired notary seal, same 3-month window 2 years ago. 6 vehicles that I can find so far, and there may be more." Clay took the phone and scrolled slowly through each image, his jaw tightening with each new page. "You're certain about this?" "I've seen fraud before, Clay. I managed books for a real estate company for 2 years before I..." She stopped herself. The old reflex, protecting Nathan's name even here, even now. "Before I left, I know what deliberate looks like versus sloppy." "This is deliberate." Behind Clay, Big Sam's voice cut in from the next bay over, wrench still in hand. 2 years ago. That's around when old man Terrence ran the front office. Before his heart gave out, Clay's expression darkened. Terrence never touched vehicle transfers. That wasn't his role. He handled scrap weight and customer intake, so he processed them. Amber asked. The silence that followed had genuine weight to it. Clay looked at the photographs again, his thumb hovering over the screen, and Amber watched something shift in his face, the specific, controlled stillness of a man recalculating everyone he'd trusted. "I need names," he said finally, quiet and hard. "Every signature on every document. Cross-reference it against payroll from that period. Today, before anyone else touches this." "What are you thinking?" Amber asked. Clay handed her phone back, his eyes distant, working through something she couldn't yet see. "I'm thinking somebody has been running a chop shop through my own paperwork, under my own name, and I've been too busy keeping this club clean to notice a rat sitting in my own front office." He turned and walked toward the trailer without another word, and Amber followed, her mind already racing through the implications. If someone inside Steel Haven had been complicit in vehicle fraud, the legal exposure was real, not the vague threats in Nathan's lawyer's letter, but actual provable criminal liability that could shut the entire operation down if the wrong people found it first. And if Nathan's letter had arrived at almost the exact same moment she'd uncovered this, she stopped walking. Clay, he turned. What if this isn't a coincidence? What if whoever did this knows I've been going through the files, and the letter from Nathan's lawyers isn't actually about Nathan at all? What if it's a distraction, a way to make everyone focus on me while something else stays buried in these cabinets? Clay's eyes narrowed. That's a hell of a theory. I lived 4 years married to a man who used distraction as a weapon, Amber said. I know what it looks like when someone wants you looking in one direction while something else happens behind you. Clay was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, slow and grim. Then we don't tell anyone outside this trailer what you found. Not yet. Not until I know exactly who I'm dealing with. The next several days passed in a strange, taut quiet, the particular silence that settles over a place right before something breaks. Amber worked longer hours than she needed to, driven by something that had shifted inside her, some old instinct awakening that the years have forced dormancy. She had been capable once. She had been sharp once, before Nathan had spent 4 years convincing her, in increments so gradual she hadn't registered the erosion happening beneath her feet, that she couldn't balance a checkbook without his oversight, couldn't be trusted with decisions, couldn't survive without him managing every corner of her existence. She had believed him. That was the part that still ignited a cold fury in her late at night. Staring at motel ceilings in the dark, she had actually believed him, but sitting in that trailer, cross-referencing payroll records against forged signatures, building a case with the same careful precision she'd once applied to corporate books before Nathan decided that employment was beneath a wife of his, Amber felt something return to her that she'd believed he'd permanently taken, her own mind, sharp, capable, entirely her own. She found the name on a Thursday afternoon, buried in an old handwritten payroll ledger that predated the yard's switch to digital records. A former front office employee, Russ Corbin's 8 months at Steel Haven, exactly 2 years ago. Employment terminated abruptly, no explanation recorded, and his signature, when Amber laid it beside the forged transfer documents, matched in 3 distinct, unmistakable ways. She brought the ledger to Clay immediately. Clay looked at the name for a long time without speaking. Then, in a voice gone flat and cold, Russ Corbin, you know him. I fired him. Clay set the ledger down with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something that might detonate. 8 months into the job, I caught him skimming cash off scrap sales. Didn't have enough solid proof to take it further, so I cut him loose. Told him if I ever saw his face on this property again, there'd be consequences. He looked up at Amber. I didn't know about vehicles. I had no idea he had access to transfer paperwork at all. Where's he now? Clay's expression turned grim. That, he said, is exactly what I intend to find out. What Amber didn't know. What she wouldn't learn for another several days, though the pieces would eventually snap together with sickening clarity, was that Russ Corbin had not simply drifted away after being fired from Steel Haven. He had found new employment almost immediately. Employment that gave him access to something far more dangerous than scrapyard paperwork. He had gone to work for a private investigation firm. Specifically, the firm currently under contract to Nathan Mercer. Grissom, the investigator, who had sat across from Nathan's desk delivering progress reports in his flat professional voice, had hired Corbin 6 months ago as a local subcontractor, a man with regional knowledge and established connections, someone who knew which doors in this part of the state opened easiest when cash was applied. Corbin hadn't known at first that the woman his new employer was hunting had ended up working at the exact scrapyard where his old fraud scheme sat buried in a neglected filing cabinet. When he found out, through a casual description from Grissom, a physical sketch that matched too precisely to be coincidence, he had felt something very close to panic. Because if Amber Collins was moving through those files with the thoroughness Grissom's briefing described, she wouldn't just uncover evidence of a bad marriage. She would find him. Amber knew none of this yet. What she knew on that Thursday evening was that Clay had gone very quiet and hard in a way she hadn't seen before, making calls behind his closed office door. His voice a low murmur she couldn't decipher through the walls. She was gathering her things to leave for the night when Rosa appeared in the trailer doorway, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "You should head out the back way tonight," Rosa said. Amber's stomach tightened. "Why?" "Sedan's back. Different plates again. But Deacon caught the same scratch on the front bumper from 3 weeks ago. It's parked about a quarter mile down Route 9. Just sitting there." Rose's voice was steady, but her eyes carried real worrying. "Clay wants you to stay here tonight. There's a court in the back office. Nobody's going to bother you here. I can't just—" "You can and you will." Rose's tone left no room for argument. "This isn't up for debate. Not tonight." Amber's hands had begun shaking again, the old, familiar fear rising up her spine like cold water. She thought about the sedan, about Nathan's messages, about a private investigator's photograph of her license plate in Kentucky, about a letter written by lawyers she recognized sitting in Clay's desk drawer. He was close. She could feel it now. "The way you sense a storm before the color of the sky changes." "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll stay." The court in the back office was thin, and the blanket carried the scent of motor oil. But Amber slept better there than she had in the motel in weeks. Maybe it was the sound of Deacon's motorcycle idling near the gate through most of the night. Maybe it was knowing that Big Sam had positioned himself in the garage bay nearest the road, ostensibly working an engine rebuild that she was fairly certain didn't actually require a night shift. Maybe it was simply the accumulated weight of 3 weeks spent among people who had decided, without extracting anything in return, that she was worth protecting. She woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices outside. Her heart slammed into her throat as she scrambled off the cot, pulling on her shoes, moving toward the office window with her pulse so loud she could hear it in her ears. Through the gap in the blinds, she saw Clay standing near the front gate alongside 4 members of the club she recognized by now. Deacon, Big Sam, lean quiet Tucker who ran the crane, and Frank, the older one who kept mostly to himself with his engines. Standing opposite them, outside the gate, was a man in a grey suit that cost more than everything Amber currently owned combined. Her stomach dropped before she'd fully processed his face. Not Nathan. She recognized him after a disorienting moment of panic. Whitfield, a younger associate from Nathan's family firm who had handled some of the earlier divorce proceedings Nathan had weaponized into a year-long siege. "I have every legal right to be on this property," Whitfield was saying, his voice carrying the particular smugness of someone who had never once in his life encountered consequences he couldn't purchase away. "I'm simply here to deliver formal notice." "You delivered your notice by mail," Clay said, his voice a low rumble that carried easily across the morning quiet. "This is my property. You're trespassing." "I have every legal—" "You have the right to leave," Clay interrupted. "Before I decide you don't." Amber pressed her hand over her mouth, watching through the blinds, torn between every instinct to hide and a fierce, unfamiliar urge to walk out there and face this herself. Whitfield's eyes swept the property, and for one heart-stopping second, Amber was certain he'd caught her silhouette in the office window. But his gaze kept moving, landing instead on the trailer, where she'd spent the past 3 weeks rebuilding 15 years of chaos into something functional. "My client has reason to believe his wife is being harbored on this property," Whitfield said. "Interfering with a legal marital dispute carries significant liability for ex-wife," Clay corrected, his voice going hard as steel. "And I don't know what you think you're going to find here, counselor, but I'd strongly suggest you get back into whatever brought you and drive it in the direction you came from." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," Clay said. "Same as the fact that this conversation is being recorded." He gestured almost lazily toward a small camera mounted above the gate that Amber hadn't noticed until now. "Same as the fact that if you or anyone working for your client steps onto this property again without a warrant, you'll be having your next conversation with my lawyer. And trust me, you don't want that conversation." Whitfield's composure fractured, just slightly. The first genuine crack Amber had seen. He hadn't expected resistance this organized, this calm. He'd expected intimidation to land the way it usually did on people who lacked the resources to push back. "This isn't over," Whitfield said, finally retreating toward the black sedan, the same sedan Amber realized with fresh nausea that had been circling the yard for weeks. "Didn't figure it would be," Clay said. "Tell your client something for me." Whitfield paused at the car door. "Tell him this yard doesn't scare," Clay said. "And neither does the woman he's looking for. Tell him whatever he believes he's owed here. He's not getting it. Not while she's standing on this property." The sedan pulled away. Amber remained frozen at the window longer it had disappeared, her entire body trembling with adrenaline. She didn't know how to release Dot. When Clay walked into the back office 10 minutes later, she was still there, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the empty road. "You heard all of that?" he asked. "Every word." Clay's expression softened, the closest thing to tenderness Amber had seen from him. "He's testing limits, sending lawyers, because he thinks paperwork frightens people like us." A dry, humorless smile crossed his weathered face. "He's about to learn how badly he's miscalculated." "Clay." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Is this going to get worse before it gets better?" Clay didn't soften the answer, and she found, strangely, that she was grateful for that. "Probably," he admitted. "Men like him don't stop because you say no. They stop when saying no stops costing them anything to argue with, when the price of the fight outweighs whatever they believe they're owed." He studied her for a moment. "But you're not facing that alone anymore. Whatever he throws at you, he's throwing at this entire club now too." Amber didn't trust her voice. She just nodded, blinking hard against the sudden burn behind her eyes. 2 days later, the second move arrived, and it came from a direction the one at Steel Haven had anticipated. A phone call to the front office. Not a lawyer this time, the county's regulatory compliance division, informing Clay that Steel Haven Salvage was scheduled for an emergency inspection the following week due to multiple citizen complaints regarding environmental and licensing violations. Clay hung up slowly, his expression unreadable, and relayed the news to Amber and Rosa in the trailer. "We've never had a complaint filed against us," Rosa said immediately, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Not in 11 years. Clay runs this place cleaner than half the operations in the county." "Somebody filed complaints anyway," Clay said. "Multiple ones, enough to trigger an emergency inspection instead of the usual scheduled cycle." Amber felt something cold settle into her stomach like ballast. "This is him. We don't know that." "Clay, think about the timing." Her mind was already racing through the pattern. The same instinct that had caught the fraud in the filing cabinets, now firing on something immediate and far more dangerous. Letter from his lawyers, then a lawyer showing up physically, now suddenly citizen complaints triggering an emergency inspection. All within 2 weeks of him locating me. This is exactly what Nathan does. He doesn't attack directly. He uses institutions. He weaponizes regulations. He buries you in bureaucracy because it's legal, and it's slow and it's exhausting. And by the time anyone understands what's happening, the damage is already done. Clay's jaw tightened as the pieces clicked together. "He's trying to shut the yard down," Amber said. "He's trying to make it too expensive to keep me here. If Steel Haven gets hit with violations, fines, maybe even a shutdown order, that's pressure on you, on everyone here, because of me." That's precisely how he operates. He never threatens you directly. He threatens everything around you until you're the one who has to make the hard choice. The trailer fell silent. Rosa looked between them, her expression tight. "So what do we do?" she finally asked. Clay's eyes moved to the growing stack of files Amber had organized over the past 3 weeks. The fraud documentation, the forged signatures, the evidence connecting Russ Corbin to 6 laundered vehicles processed under Steel Haven's name. "We make sure," Clay said slowly, "that when those inspectors walk through that gate, they find a business that's cleaner than clean. And we make sure Amber is standing next to me when they do. Because if this county sends legitimate inspectors, They're going to find real records, real documentation, and real proof that every complaint filed against this property is garbage. And if they're not real inspectors, Amber asked quietly, what if someone Nathan paid off is already carrying forged paperwork before they walk through the gate? Clay's eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. Then you're going to catch it, he said. The same way you caught everything else in this trailer that everyone else missed for 15 years. The weight of that settled onto Amber's shoulders, heavy and terrifying, and, somewhere beneath the fear, strangely exhilarating. For 4 years, she had been told she wasn't capable of managing anything more complex than a grocery list. Now a man who had built a business and led a motorcycle club for 2 decades was telling her that the entire future of Steelhaven Salvage might rest on her ability to spot a lie inside a stack of government paperwork. I won't let you down, she said. I know you won't, Clay said. That's exactly why I'm not worried. The week that followed was a blur of furious, focused preparation. Amber worked from before sunrise to well after dark, pulling every environmental compliance document Steelhaven had filed across the past decade, cross-referencing permit numbers, verifying disposal certifications, assembling a paper trail so thorough that any legitimate inspection would walk away empty-handed. Rosa helped where she could, keeping Amber fed and hydrated through 12 to 14-hour stretches. Deacon and Big Sam worked through the physical side of things, combing the yard bay by bay to ensure every piece of equipment met code. Every hazardous material was properly contained and labeled. Every fire extinguisher current and accessible. Clay oversaw everything with the quiet, relentless focus of a man who had survived worse and intended to survive this too. But it was the 4th night of preparation, well past midnight, both of them alone in the trailer, surrounded by mountains of paper, that Amber found the piece that changed everything. Clay. Her voice was barely a whisper. Something in its tone made him look up immediately. Look at this. She held out a printed document, an environmental compliance filing from 18 months ago. One of the routine inspection reports the county required annually. That's a standard filing, he said. We pass those every year. Look at the form number. She pointed to the small code printed in the corner. This form was discontinued by the state 2 years ago. They replaced the entire format after an audit revealed a loophole that allowed businesses to falsify disposal records. Clay's eyes narrowed. You're saying this is fake? I'm saying someone used an outdated, discontinued form to file this, Amber said, her pulse quickening as the pattern crystallized. Which means either our previous inspector was working from paperwork they should have known was obsolete, possible, if sloppy, or someone deliberately chose an old form because it was easier to manipulate. She pulled out another document and laid it beside the first, same discontinued form, filed for the same property, 6 months apart, by 2 different inspectors who supposedly had no connection to each other. Clay stared at both documents for a long moment, and then something dark and furious moved through his eyes. You're telling me someone has been running 2 separate schemes through my paperwork? Vehicle fraud 2 years ago, environmental filing fraud within the last 18 months. I'm telling you, Amber said slowly, the full weight of the realization settling over her, that if the same corrupt paperwork is what triggered this county inspection, and if whoever is coming next week is using these same discontinued forms as their evidence of violations, then it isn't a real inspection. It's a setup, Clay finished, his voice going grim. The trailer fell into heavy silence, broken only by the distant hum of the yard's security lights and the low idle of Deacon's motorcycle somewhere near the gate. We need to know who's coming, Amber said finally. Not just the department, names, badge numbers, everything before they walk through that gate. Clay was already reaching for his phone. I know someone at the county office, old friend who brings his truck here every year for maintenance. No charge, on account of some trouble I helped him with a long time back. He dialed, his voice dropping into the low, patient register Amber had learned meant he was calling in something that mattered. She listened to half a conversation she couldn't fully follow, watching Clay's expression move through concentration, then surprise, then something colder and harder than she'd yet seen from him. He hung up and turned to her slowly. The inspection scheduled for next week isn't coming from the regular county compliance office, Clay said. It's a special task force, formed 6 weeks ago to investigate irregular salvage operations in this district, funded through a state grant. He paused, letting the next part land with deliberate weight. A grant application submitted and approved through the sponsorship of Mercer Holdings. Amber's blood went cold. He didn't just file a complaint, she whispered. He built an entire task force, funded it himself, gave it just enough legitimate cover that nobody would think to question where the money came from. And now he's sending it straight through your front gate. Looks that way, Clay said grimly. Clay, this isn't just about frightening me anymore. Her hands had begun shaking again, the old fear rising alongside something new, something fierce and protective on behalf of people who had done nothing except open a gate for a stranger with $40 and nowhere to go. This is about destroying this place, whatever it costs him. He'd rather burn Steel Haven to the ground than let me have somewhere safe to stand. Clay's jaw tightened. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something low and absolutely certain. Then he's about to find out, he said, that this yard was built by men who've survived worse than money. He looked at the mountain of documentation spread across the desk between them, the forged signatures, the discontinued forms, years of fraud now converging into a single undeniable pattern that pointed toward a conspiracy far larger than either of them had first suspected. Next week, Clay said, when that task force walks through my gate thinking they're going to find violations to shut me down, they're going to find something else entirely. Amber finished for him, something steely settling into her voice that surprised her with its own strength. The truth, she said, all of it, laid out so clearly that no amount of his money will be able to bury it again. Outside, security lights flickered against the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, Deacon's motorcycle idled on, steady and low, keeping watch the way he had every night since the sedan first appeared. Amber gathered the documents into careful, methodical order, her mind already racing ahead to the work still needed before the task force arrived. Every date verified, every falsified signature traced back to its source. A case built so airtight that even a government body bought and paid for by Nathan Mercer's money wouldn't be able to twist truth into something it was and single quotes D. She had walked through that gate carrying nothing but fear and $40, certain she was vanishing into the one place her old life would never think to look. She hadn't expected to find something worth fighting for. She hadn't expected to rediscover herself in the process, but sitting in the quiet hum of the trailer at 2 a.m, surrounded by evidence of a lie that stretched back years, flanked by a man who had decided without hesitation that her safety was worth risking his own livelihood for, Amber Collins felt something settle into place inside her that Nathan Mercer had spent 4 years trying to convince her didn't exist. Her own strength, intact, untouched, entirely her own. Whatever walked through that gate next week, she would be ready for it. The task force arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after Clay's phone call to his contact at the county office. Amber had not slept more than 4 hours on any of those 6 nights. She didn't feel the exhaustion, not really. Something had taken hold inside her chest that burned hotter than fatigue, a focus so total it felt almost like the adrenaline Nathan used to generate in her. Except this time, it didn't come from fear. It came from purpose. By the time the black SUVs rolled through Steel Haven's front gate at 9 a.m, Amber had assembled a binder 3 inches thick, every discrepancy cross-referenced, every forged signature laid beside its legitimate counterpart, every discontinued form flagged with the exact date the state had retired it, printed directly from the state regulatory website, time-stamped, notarized by an actual notary whose current credentials Amber had personally verified. She stood beside Clay at the front steps of the office trailer, hands folded to keep them from shaking, and watched for people climb out of the vehicles. 3 carried county badges and clipboards, moving with the practiced boredom of officials who'd performed this kind of inspection dozens of times. The 4th wore a suit that had no business near a scrapyard, pressed, expensive, the precise shade of grey that only appeared in wardrobes built by someone with more money than restraint. That's not county. Clay murmured under his breath. No, Amber agreed. That's a lawyer. The lead inspector, a broad man named Halloran, badge clipped to his lapel and clipboard already open, approached first, his expression carrying the particular self-importance of a low-level official handed authority other than his usual jurisdiction. Steelhaven Salvage, Halloran said without looking up. We hear regarding multiple citizen complaints of environmental violations, improper disposal documentation, and unlicensed vehicle processing. This is a mandatory compliance inspection under emergency provisions. Good morning to you too, Clay said, his voice flat and thoroughly unimpressed. You got names on those complaints, or is that confidential? Complainant information is protected. Convenient, Clay said. Halloran's jaw tightened. I'll need full access to your facility, disposal logs, vehicle intake records for the past 3 years, and all environmental compliance filings on record. Everything you need is right here, Amber said, stepping forward before Clay could respond, holding out the 3-inch binder with both hands, her voice steadier than she expected. Organized by year, cross-referenced by document type. I'm happy to walk you through anything that needs clarification. Halloran blinked. He hadn't expected this level of preparation from a scrapyard that 6 citizen complaints, filed, Amber now suspected, by people who didn't exist, had characterized as a lawless dumping ground. He took the binder slowly, flipping through the first few pages with a frown that suggested he wasn't sure what he was looking at. That was when the man in the grey suit stepped forward. Actually, he said, his voice carrying the particular smoothness of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves for his convenience. Before the inspection proceeds, there's a separate matter I need to address. My name is Whitfield. I represent Nathan Mercer. Amber's stomach dropped. She hadn't expected him here, physically, on this property again. After Clay had all but removed him by force 2 weeks ago. You're trespassing, Clay said immediately, his voice going hard. I'm accompanying a county-sanctioned inspection, Whitfield corrected smoothly. Entirely legal, and I have separate legal documents to serve to Mrs. Mercer, who I understand is currently employed on this property. There's no Mrs. Mercer here, Amber said, and her voice, to her own genuine surprise, did not waver. My name is Amber Collins. The court records still reflect. The court records reflect a marriage that ended the night I left, Amber said. You can call me whatever you'd like, Mr. Whitfield. It doesn't change who signs my paychecks, and it doesn't change whose property you're currently standing on while pretending to participate in a government inspection. Something flickered across Whitfield's face. Surprise, possibly, at the steadiness she projected, or irritation that his usual playbook wasn't producing the expected result. He recovered quickly, producing a manila envelope from his briefcase. These are formal documents regarding the financial settlement my client believes you're obligated to honor, as well as a restraining request related to what my client characterizes as your abandonment of shared marital assets. Clay's hand came down on the envelope before Amber could reach for it, stopping Whitfield cold. She's not accepting anything from you today, Clay said. You want to serve legal papers. You do it through her actual attorney, not by ambushing her during a business inspection. Clearly orchestrated yourself. I have no idea what you're implying. Sure you don't, Clay said. Halloran, still moving through Amber's binder with a deepening frown, looked up between the two men with obvious confusion. Is there a problem here? Because I was told this was a straightforward compliance matter. There's no problem, Whitfield said quickly. Just a separate civil matter that happens to intersect with today's proceedings. It's not separate, Amber said. and something in her voice made everyone in the group turn toward her. "It's the same matter, Inspector Halloran. The same man who's trying to serve me legal papers right now is the same man whose company sponsored the state grant that funded this task force. I'd be very curious whether you knew that when you accepted this assignment." The silence that followed was absolute. Halloran's eyes moved slowly from Amber to Whitfield, something calculating and genuinely uneasy crossing his face. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," Amber said. Reaching into the separate folder she and Clay had prepared specifically for this moment. "It's public record. Mercer Holdings' name is listed as the primary sponsor on the grant application that created your task force 6 weeks ago. I pulled it from the state database 3 days ago." She held out a printed copy, the state seal clearly visible at the top. "The timing aligns precisely with when Mr. Mercer's legal team confirmed my location at this address." Halloran took the document with visibly unsteady hands, scanning it once, then a second time, his expression shifting from professional detachment toward something that looked increasingly like alarm. "This says nothing illegal happened," Whitfield interjected quickly. "Private citizens and companies fund public initiatives constantly. There's nothing improper about a state grant," Amber agreed. "There's something very improper about using that grant to direct an investigative task force toward a specific private business, specifically to pressure an employee who happens to be your client's ex-wife. That isn't compliance enforcement, Mr. Whitfield. That's targeted retaliation dressed in a government badge." One of the junior inspectors, a younger woman who had stayed quiet until now, cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Sir, if this task force was funded specifically to target a single property connected to a personal dispute that could constitute misuse of state funds, we'd need to escalate this before continuing. There is no personal dispute affecting this inspection," Whitfield said, his voice climbing half a register, the first real fracture in his composure. "This is an entirely legitimate." "Then you won't object," Clay interrupted, "to Amber showing you exactly why every complaint filed against this yard doesn't hold up." He nodded toward her, and Amber opened the second folder, the one containing the discontinued forms, the forged notary seals, the 6 laundered vehicles, everything she and Clay had assembled across 6 sleepless nights into an argument too coherent to dismiss as coincidence. "Inspector Halloran," she said, laying the documents out one by one across the hood of the nearest truck. "These are the environmental compliance forms your task force is likely planning to cite as evidence of violations. I'd like you to look at the form numbers in the corner of each page." Halloran leaned in, scanning the numbers with a frown. "These forms were discontinued by the state 2 years ago," Amber continued, "replaced after an audit revealed a loophole that allowed businesses to falsify disposal records. If your complaints reference these forms as current documentation, then whoever filed those complaints either doesn't know current state regulations, unlikely for a professional task force, or they deliberately used outdated paperwork because they knew exactly which loophole they were exploiting." "That's speculation," Whitfield said, but the smoothness had left his voice entirely. "It isn't," Amber said, reaching for the final piece, the one she and Clay had confirmed only 2 nights ago, "because these same discontinued forms were used 18 months ago to falsify environmental filings under this yard's name, filed by an inspector who no longer works for the county, cross-referenced with vehicle fraud dating back 2 years, tied to a former Steel Haven employee, Russ Corbin, who currently works as a subcontractor for the private investigation firm your client hired to locate me." The silence this time had a different quality, heavier. Halloran's face had gone pale. The 2 junior inspectors exchanged a look that made clear they were beginning to grasp that they'd been sent into something far more complicated than a routine compliance check. "You're telling me," Halloran said slowly, "that the complaints that triggered this task force were fabricated using paperwork tied to actual fraud committed against this business, and that fraud is connected to the man standing next to me." "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Amber said, and I have 3 weeks of documentation to prove every part of it. Whitfield's face had gone rigid, his earlier confidence stripped away entirely. This is outrageous. My client is a respected member of this community, and these baseless accusations are not baseless, Clay said, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous. They're sitting on the hood of that truck in black and white, counselor, and unless you want your name attached to obstruction of a state fraud investigation, I'd suggest you get back in whatever brought you here. Whitfield opened his mouth to respond. That was the exact moment a third vehicle rolled through Steel Haven's front gate. A sleek black car, moving slowly, deliberately, coming to a stop a few yards from the gathered group. Amber's blood turned to ice the instant the door opened. Nathan Mercer stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks with the casual, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once seen his life entered a room that failed to eventually arrange itself around him. He looked exactly as she remembered, expensive, controlled, handsome in the studied way of someone who invested significantly in appearing effortless. His eyes found her immediately, and something in his expression shifted, satisfaction, mixed with something considerably colder underneath. "Amber," he said, his voice carrying that same smooth, patient tone he'd always deployed in the moments right before things deteriorated. "You look tired. Running takes a lot out of a person." Every muscle in Amber's body went rigid. 4 years of trained instincts screamed at her to shrink, to soften, to locate the version of herself that had learned, through long and painful repetition, exactly how to navigate his moods in order to minimize the damage. Her hands wanted to shake, her throat wanted to close. She forced herself to stay exactly where she was. "Nathan," she said, and was almost startled by how flat and unafraid her own voice sounded. "You shouldn't be here." "I have every right to be here," Nathan said, stepping closer, apparently unconcerned by the ring of men flanking Clay, who had gone rigid, and alert the moment his car rolled through the gate. "You're my wife. You left our home, our marriage, our life together without a single conversation. I've spent 5 months and considerable resources trying to understand why. I think I've earned the right to look you in the eye. We're divorced, Nathan. The papers have been finalized," Amber said. "You know that. There are financial matters still pending. Yes, assets you walked away from that legally belong to both parties. I simply want what's fair. You want control," Amber said, and this time her voice carried an edge she hadn't allowed herself in 4 years. "You've always wanted control, Nathan. You just called it fairness because it sounds better in front of an audience." Something moved across Nathan's face, irritation, at the audience itself, at Clay and Deacon and Big Sam watching from a few feet away, at the inspector and his clipboard, at the entire scene unfolding in a way he clearly hadn't written the script for. "I don't think this is the time or place," Nathan said, his voice tightening. "You made it the time and place," Amber said. "You funded a task force. You sent your lawyer to serve me papers during a business inspection. You had someone circling this property in a sedan for 3 weeks. You did all of that, Nathan. Not me. I did what any husband would do to protect his family," Nathan said. And for the first time something real surfaced through his controlled exterior. Real anger, close to the surface now. "You disappeared. You took nothing, said nothing, left me to explain to everyone we knew why my wife vanished in the middle of the night like someone with something to hide." "I left in the middle of the night," Amber said, her voice trembling now, but not with fear, with something closer to 4 years of fury, finally given permission to exist. "Because the last time I tried to leave during daylight hours, you broke my wrist too. Convinced me to stay." The words landed like a physical impact across the entire gathered group. Halloran's pen stopped moving. The younger inspector's eyes went wide. Deacon's hands curled, slowly, into fists at his sides, and Clay went very, very still, the particular stillness of a man exercising enormous, deliberate restraint. Nathan's face had gone pale, his composure cracking visibly for the first time. That was an accident. You fell. You know you fell." I know exactly what happened, Amber said. I have the emergency room records to prove it, Nathan. Records I kept quietly for 4 years, because some part of me always understood that someday I might need them. I never wanted to use them. I just wanted to be free of you. Her voice steadied, gaining strength with each word. But you didn't let me have that, did you? You kept hunting. You kept proving that I couldn't survive without you managing my existence. So congratulations, Nathan. You've proven the opposite. I survived. I built something here. And now you've dragged your own fraud into the daylight trying to destroy it. My fraud. Nathan's voice climbed, real panic bleeding through as that the polished exterior had fully shattered. I don't know what you're talking about, Russ Corbin, Amber said. Your investigator's subcontractor, former Steel Haven employee, fired for skimming cash, whose signature appears on 6 forged vehicle transfers processed through this yard's paperwork 2 years ago, and on falsified environmental filings 18 months ago that conveniently used discontinued state forms. The exact same forms your task force's complaints are built around. Nathan's mouth opened and then closed. For the first time since Amber had known him, she watched him search for words and find nothing. You didn't just want to find me, Amber continued, her voice ringing clear across the yard, loud enough now that even the inspectors standing at a distance could hear every word. You wanted to bury this business so completely that I'd have nowhere left to go except back to you. You used a man who already had a history of fraud against this yard, gave him resources and motive, and let him build a scheme that had nothing to do with finding me and everything to do with destroying the one place that gave me somewhere to stand. This is insane, Nathan said, but his voice had lost everything it had walked through that gate carrying. Inspector Halloran, Amber said, turning deliberately away from Nathan and toward the county official, whose face had gone from pale to genuinely alarmed. I'd like to formally request that everything discussed here today be documented as part of your official report, including Mr. Mercer's presence, his connection to the grant funding your task force, and his connection through his investigation firm to Russ Corbin, whose fraudulent paperwork appears to be the basis for the complaints against this business. Halloran looked between Amber, Clay, and Nathan, and something settled in his expression, the look of a man who had just realized he'd been deployed as a weapon in someone else's war, and who deeply resented the discovery. Ma'am, he said slowly, I think we need to pause this inspection entirely and escalate to the State Fraud Division. What you're describing isn't a compliance issue. It's potential criminal conspiracy, misuse of public funds, and possibly witness intimidation. No, Nathan said sharply, stepping forward. This inspection needs to proceed as scheduled. There are legitimate violations at this property that, Sir, Halloran interrupted, his voice suddenly carrying an authority he hadn't held all morning. I'd strongly advise you to leave this property immediately. Given what's being presented, your continued presence could be construed as interference with a state investigation. Nathan's face contorted with a fury he could no longer disguise, the mask finally and completely gone, revealing something ugly underneath. The same expression Amber realized, with a chill that moved through her slowly, that had preceded every worst moment of their marriage. You think this changes anything? Nathan said, rounding on Amber, his voice low and venomous now that everything else had fallen away. You think hiding behind a bunch of criminals in leather protects you? You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder every single day. I have resources you can't even imagine. I have patience you cannot outlast. Nathan. Clay's voice cut through the air like a blade, quiet and absolutely final. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Nathan and Amber without appearing to hurry, his presence alone enough to make Nathan take an involuntary step back. You've said your piece. Now you're going to get back in your car and leave this property. And if I ever see you, or anyone connected to you, within a mile of this yard again, the conversation we have won't involve lawyers, or inspectors, or paperwork. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Is that a threat? Nathan said, though his voice had shed most of its earlier bravado. It's a promise, Clay said, Same as the promise I made to Amber the day she walked through that gate. Nobody touches her. Nobody threatens her. Nobody raises their voice at her on this property or anywhere near the people who work here. You want to test that promise? You're welcome to try. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Nathan's eyes swept across the gathered group. Clay immovable in front of him. Deacon and Big Sam flanking either side, with expressions carved from stone. Frank having appeared at some points during the confrontation, standing at the yard's edge like a wall no rational person would attempt. Something in Nathan's calculation finally shifted. Amber watched it happen in real time. The moment a man who had spent his entire life getting everything he wanted through money, pressure, and the slow patient application of cruelty realized that none of those tools operated here. "This isn't finished," Nathan said. But the words came out hollowed out, already retreating toward his car. "It is for you," Amber said quietly, and something in her own voice surprised her. Not triumph exactly, but a kind of exhausted, hard-won clarity settling into the space where 4 years of fear had lived. "You don't get to control this anymore, Nathan. Any of it. Not me. Not this place. Not what happens next." He didn't respond. He got in his car. Whitfield scrambled after him. The black sedan pulled through Steel Haven's gate and disappeared down the road, taking with it 4 years of dread that had followed Amber through every waking moment since the night she'd finally found the courage to leave. Amber stood frozen for a long moment after the car vanished. Her whole body was trembling with the release of adrenaline that had kept her upright through the entire confrontation. Clay's hand landed gently on her shoulder, not possessive, not demanding, just steady, grounding. "You okay?" "I don't know yet," Amber admitted, her voice shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "Ask me again in an hour." Halloran approached slowly, his earlier officiousness entirely replaced by something more careful, almost apologetic. "Miss Collins, I owe you an apology. I had no idea the complaints against this property were connected to something like this. I'll be filing a full report to the State Fraud Division today, and I suspect this task force will be dissolved before the week is out." "Thank you," Amber said. "You should also know," Halloran added, glancing toward the road where the sedan's dust was still settling, "that misuse of state grant funds is a serious criminal matter. Depending on what the Fraud Division finds, Mr. Mercer could be facing charges that extend well beyond a civil dispute." Something loosened in Amber's chest, just slightly. For the first time in 5 months, the days that followed moved differently than any Amber had experienced since arriving at Steel Haven. Not, exactly. The State Fraud Division's involvement brought its own sustained flurry of interviews, statements, and document requests. But there was a different quality to the exhaustion now. It felt earned rather than imposed. It felt like the aftermath of a fight she had chosen to have, rather than one that had simply happened to her. Russ Corbin was arrested 11 days later, picked up at a motel to counties over. Within 48 hours of his arrest, he had begun cooperating with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, a decision that unraveled the entire scheme with startling speed. He confirmed everything Amber had suspected. Grissom, Nathan's investigator, had connected him to the fraud years before Amber ever arrived at Steel Haven, had known about the vehicle laundering scheme from the beginning, and had seen an opportunity, once Amber's location was confirmed, to weaponize Corbin's existing access, manufacturing violations designed to bury the yard in paper. Nathan's name appeared in the state's official complaint 3 weeks after that. Not as the primary criminal target. His lawyers had clearly worked overtime to insulate him from direct liability, but as a person of interest in the misuse of grant funding, facing a civil investigation that would likely cost him far more in legal fees and reputation than he had ever intended to spend chasing his ex-wife across state lines. It wasn't a total victory. Amber understood that. Men like Nathan Mercer rarely faced the full weight of what their actions deserved. Money built to many buffers, purchased to many delays, kept to many lawyers working around the clock trading technicalities for time. But it was enough. More than enough. He would spend the next several years fighting battles of his own making instead of hunting her. And for the first time since she'd driven away from their house with nothing but a duffel bag, Amber allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't require constant vigilance over her shoulder. Clay found her in the trailer on a quiet Thursday evening, the fraud investigation's paperwork finally slowing to a manageable pace, the yard settling back into its familiar rhythm of grinding metal and low engine growls. "You did good," he said, leaning in the doorway. "We did good," Amber corrected. "I couldn't have gotten through any of this without you. Without all of you." Clay considered that for a moment, his eyes moving across the trailer, transformed now. 3 months after that first afternoon, from a disaster of forgotten paperwork into an organized, functional office that ran more efficiently than the yard had in over a decade. "You know," he said slowly, "when you walked through that gate with $40 and a backpack, I figured I was giving a scared woman somewhere to disappear for a few weeks before she moved on to the next town." "I remember. I was wrong," Clay said. "You weren't hiding. You were just waiting for somewhere solid enough to stand and start from." He paused, something almost like pride crossing his weathered face. "This yard's never had anybody like you running these records. Never had anybody catch fraud that ran this deep, this far back. Half the reason we survived that task force was because you'd already built a case nobody could argue with." Amber felt something warm rise in her chest, unfamiliar after years of being told, in 100 small and devastating ways, that she was a burden rather than a contribution. "What are you saying, Clay?" "I'm saying," Clay said, "that Friday's deadline expired about 10 weeks ago and I never got around to telling you. The job's permanent." He held out his hand, the same gesture he'd offered the day she first walked through the gate. Except this time, it meant something entirely different. "Been meaning to make it official. Been putting it off because some part of me figured you'd want to leave once the danger passed. Start fresh somewhere Nathan Mercer's name doesn't mean anything." Amber looked around the trailer, organized, purposeful, hers in every sense that mattered. Then out the window toward the yard, where Deacon was laughing at something Big Sam had said, where Rosa was locking up the front counter for the night, where a community of people she had known for barely 3 months had become, without her fully registering, when it happened, something that felt dangerously close to family. "I don't want to leave," she said quietly. "I want to stay. If you'll have me." "Wasn't really a question," Clay said, a rare smile breaking across his weathered face. "More of a formality." Amber laughed. "A real one, the kind that came from somewhere deep and unguarded, from a place Nathan had spent 4 years trying to seal permanently shut. She had walked through that gate 3 months ago believing she was accepting a last resort. The job nobody wanted, the place nobody would think to look, the desperate final option for a woman with nothing left to lose. She hadn't understood then that she was walking into exactly the opposite. She hadn't known. She was choosing herself. The permanent job offer came on a Thursday. By the following Monday, the world had tilted sideways again. It started with a phone call Clay took in his office, door closed, voice dropping into that low, controlled register Amber had learned to recognize as trouble. She was 2 files deep into a routine intake log when Rosa appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, worrying etched into every line of her face. "Clay wants you in his office," Rosa said. "Now." Amber's stomach dropped before she even stood. Clay was behind his desk when she walked in, phone still in his hand, his expression unreadable in a way that frightened her more than open anger would have. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." Clay studied her for a moment, then nodded, respecting it. That was the county fraud division. Follow up on Corbin's cooperation deal. He set the phone down slowly. They found something in his financial records. Wire transfers going back almost 3 years. Money moving from an account tied to Mercer Holdings into a shell company Corbin controlled. "That's not surprising," Amber said carefully. "We already knew Nathan funded." "The dates don't match what we thought," Clay interrupted. "The first transfer was made 3 years ago. A full year before I ever fired Corbin for skimming cash." He paused, letting that land, which means Nathan wasn't just using an already corrupt employee to launder vehicles 2 years back. He planted Corbin here. Before you ever left your marriage, before any of this started. Amber felt the floor shift beneath her. That doesn't make sense. Why would he plant someone at a random scrapyard 3 years ago? He didn't know I'd end up here. I didn't know I'd end up here. Clay's jaw tightened. That's what's worrying me. The fraud division thinks Steel Haven wasn't random at all. They think Corbin was placed here specifically because of something else Mercer Holdings was already running through this region, separate from you entirely. A money laundering infrastructure built years before you ever walked through that gate. The room went very quiet. Amber's mind raced backward through everything she thought she'd understood about the past 3 months. The fraud she'd uncovered, the vehicles, the forged documents, trying to fit this darker shape into the picture. "You're saying I didn't stumble into Nathan's revenge scheme," she said slowly. "You're saying I stumbled into something Nathan was already running, and finding me here was a coincidence that happened to intersect with a scheme that predates me entirely. That's what the fraud division thinks. Then this was never just about me," Amber whispered. Clay's silence confirmed what she already knew. The next call came 2 days later, and this time it wasn't the fraud division. It was Amber's sister. Amber had kept contact minimal since arriving at Steel Haven. A monthly call from the payphone outside the diner in town. Never her cell, never anything traceable. Seeing her sister's name on the burner phone, Clay had insisted she carry scent ice through her veins before she'd even answered. "Lindsay, what's wrong?" Her sister's voice came through ragged, breathless, the particular sound of someone who had been crying and was failing to stop. "Amber, there were men here. 2 of them. Not the investigator from before. Different men. They didn't say who they worked for, but they had photographs of you. Recent ones. From the scrapyard." Amber's blood went cold. "How recent?" "One of them was you standing outside a building with a grey-haired man in a leather vest. It looked like it was taken within the last week. Someone had been watching Steel Haven recently, after Nathan's public humiliation at the failed inspection, after his name had surfaced in a state fraud investigation, after every rational calculation should have told a man in his position to retreat and manage the damage through lawyers rather than risk further exposure. He hadn't retreated. He'd escalated. What did they want? Amber's voice had dropped to barely a whisper. "They wanted to know if I'd heard from you. If I knew exactly where you were staying." Lindsay's voice cracked entirely. "They weren't polite about it. Amber, one of them mentioned my kid's school by name. He knew what time Tyler gets out of soccer practice. Call the police," Amber said. "Right now. Before you hang up with me. Tell them exactly what you told me. And tell them to cross-reference it with the ongoing state fraud investigation into Nathan Mercer. It's public record. They can look it up. Amber, what is happening? Why won't this end?" Amber closed her eyes, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles ached. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm going to find out. And I'm going to make sure it stops. I promise you that." She hung up and stood frozen in the yard, the late afternoon sun pressing down on her shoulders, the familiar sounds of Steel Haven grinding and rumbling around her, suddenly feeling fragile in a way they hadn't since her first week. Like a piece she'd only been borrowing. Clay found her there minutes later. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. She told him everything. The men at her sister's house, the recent photograph, the threat wrapped in the casual mention of a child's afternoon schedule. By the time she finished, Clay's expression had moved past anger into something colder and more calculated. "He's not backing down," Clay said. "Even with the fraud division circling him, even after we exposed his lawyer in front of a task force he funded himself, he's doubling down. Why would he do that? He's already exposed. Anything he does now just adds evidence against him, because men like Nathan don't calculate risk the way normal people do." Clay said grimly. "They calculate control. Losing you is never about losing a wife. It was about losing the one thing in his life he couldn't buy back or rationalize away. His pride can survive fraud charges. It can't survive you walking away and building something better without him. Amber's hands trembled. So what happens now? Clay's eyes hardened into something Amber hadn't seen from him before. Not the steady protectiveness of the past 3 months, but something closer to a promise being finalized. Now, he said, we stop playing defense. What happened over the following week moved with a velocity that left Amber's head spinning. Clay called an emergency meeting of the full club that evening. Not just the men Amber knew from the yard, but members from 3 neighboring charters, faces she'd never seen, each one listening in grim silence as Clay laid out everything: the fraud, the planted employee, the photographs taken within the past week, the threats made against her sister's children. Amber sat at the edge of that meeting feeling simultaneously exposed and more protected than she'd ever been in her entire life. These were strangers, most of them people polite society crossed the street to avoid, and every single one of them looked at her, not with suspicion or judgment, but with the same quiet, resolute determination Clay had shown from the very first day. This isn't just Steel Haven's problem anymore, said an older man Amber didn't recognize, heavy-set, scarring along one side of his jaw, a road captain patch. If he's running laundering operations through multiple charters' territory, using our own people as pawns, that's a declaration, whether he means it that way or not. What do you want to do? Clay asked. Same thing you do, the man said. We find every thread connecting Mercer Holdings to operations in this region, and we hand it directly to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, wrapped so completely that even his lawyers can't pull it apart. And in the meantime, his eyes moved to Amber, something almost gentle crossing his weathered face. Nobody touches this woman or her family, not while any of us are still breathing. Amber's throat tightened. She had to look down at her hands to hold herself together in front of a room full of strangers who had just, without hesitation, made her safety their collective responsibility. Over the following days, the investigation Clay and his contacts assembled moved with methodical, relentless precision. A financial analyst connected to one of the neighboring charters, a former forensic accountant who'd left corporate life after his own encounter with corruption, spent 3 days combing through banking records that Corbyn's corporation had opened up. What he found dwarfed everything Amber had uncovered in the trailer's filing cabinets. Nathan Mercer hadn't just planted Corbyn at Steel Haven. He had constructed a network spanning for counties, small businesses, scrapyards, auto shops, a handful of construction companies, all functioning as fronts for moving money that had no legitimate origin. Vehicle fraud had only ever been a small, almost incidental piece of a much larger operation, generating millions in laundered funds that fed back into Mercer Holdings' real estate ventures, giving the appearance of clean capital behind properties that, if traced far enough back, had been financed by crime. We're not looking at a jealous ex-husband abusing resources to hunt down his wife anymore, the analyst told Clay and Amber, spreading printouts across the trailer's newly organized desk, his voice tight with the particular disbelief of someone who'd spent his career around fraud and still found this scale shocking. We're looking at a man who has been running a criminal enterprise 4 years, who happened to marry a woman smart enough that when she finally got access to his paperwork, even accidentally, she started pulling threads that could unravel the entire thing. Amber sat back slowly in her chair. He didn't just want me back because he couldn't stand losing control, she said quietly. He needed me back because as long as I was out here, working somewhere with access to fraud investigators, state officials, financial records, I was a walking risk to everything he'd built. That's exactly right, the analyst said, and it explains something that's been bothering me since we started pulling these records. The task force he funded, the lawyers, the investigators, that wasn't just pride or control, that was damage control. He needed you found and neutralized before you accidentally connected the dots that would bring the whole operation down. Clay's expression had gone hard and focused, which means the men who threatened her sister weren't sent to intimidate a scared woman into coming home. They were sent, the analyst finished grimly, to make sure she never speaks to federal investigators. Or worse. The trailer fell into heavy silence, the full scope of the danger finally, terribly clear. That same night, Amber was walking to her car when a figure stepped out from behind a stack of crushed vehicles near the fence line. She froze, heart slamming against her ribs, every instinct screaming, before recognizing the face in the security light overhead. Grissom, Nathan's private investigator. "Don't scream," he said quickly, both hands raised, palms forward. "I'm not here to hurt you. I need 5 minutes. Get off this property," Amber said, backing toward the trailer, her hand fumbling for the small alarm Clay had given her weeks ago, the one that would summon half the yard in under 30 seconds. "I know about the laundering operation," Grissom said quickly, his voice low and urgent. "I know because I've been documenting it for the past 8 months. Every wire transfer, every shell company, every planted employee. I have all of it." Amber's finger hovered over the alarm button. "Why would you tell me that?" "Because Nathan Mercer thinks I still work for him," Grissom said. "And he doesn't know that 6 months ago his associates threatened my daughter to keep me quiet about something I stumbled onto. The same operation you and everyone here have apparently been taking apart on your own." His voice dropped even lower. "I've been building a case ever since, waiting for the right moment to hand it to federal investigators without getting my family killed in the process." Amber's mind raced, trying to reconcile the man who had circled her sister's house in a black sedan with the figure standing in front of her. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come to me instead of going directly to the FBI?" "Because Nathan just gave the order," Grissom said, urgency bleeding through every word. "Tonight. I heard it myself 20 minutes before I drove here. He's done waiting on lawyers and task forces. He's sending men to this property tonight." His eyes met hers, dead serious. "Not to talk, not to serve papers. You need to warn everyone here right now." Amber didn't waste another second. She hit the alarm. Within 90 seconds, the yard had transformed from quiet darkness into controlled, purposeful motion. Clay emerged from his office, already reaching for his phone. Deacon and Big Sam appeared from different directions, expressions hardened and alert. Rosa rushed from the front counter with fear written plainly across her face. "Report," Clay said. "Grissom," Amber said, pointing toward the investigator standing frozen near the fence line, clearly uncertain whether he'd just made the best or worst decision of his life. "He says Nathan is sending men here tonight. Not lawyers, not paperwork. He's out of patience." Clay's eyes moved to Grissom with cold, immediate suspicion. "Why should I believe anything you say?" "Because I've spent 8 months building a case against the man who signs my paycheck, and I just handed it to the one woman who could actually use it," Grissom said, pulling a thick folder from inside his jacket and extending it with visibly shaking hands. "Because my daughter is in danger the same as her sister's children, and I'm done being a coward about it." Clay took the folder, flipped slowly through the pages, his expression hardened with each one. "This is real," he said, looking up at Amber. "This is everything we need to end this permanently." "Then we need to move fast," Amber said. And in the distance, cutting her off, came the sound of engines. Multiple vehicles, moving fast, still minutes away, but closing. Clay turned to the assembled group, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Everybody knows their positions. We've drilled this before. Nobody engages unless engaged first. Rosa, get inside the office, lock the door, and call the sheriff right now. Tell them exactly what's happening." His eyes found Amber. "Amber, I'm not hiding," she said immediately. "I wasn't going to ask you to," Clay said. "I need you documenting everything. Every vehicle, every face, every word spoken. If this goes to federal court, we need it airtight." Amber nodded, pulling out her phone with hands that had somehow steadied despite the terror coursing beneath her skin, positioning herself near the trailer window with a clear line of sight to the gate. The vehicles arrived 4 minutes later. 3 trucks, no headlights, rolling to a stop just outside Steelhaven's front gate with the deliberate, practiced menace of men who had done this kind of work before. 6 men climbed out. Even from a distance, Amber could see they weren't dressed like lawyers. Clay stepped forward alone to meet them at the gate, flanked at distance by Deacon, Big Sam, and a dozen members from neighboring charters who had arrived within the hour, dropping everything without hesitation when Clay's call came through. "This is private property," Clay said, his voice carrying clear and hard across the yard's tense silence. "You're going to want to turn around." The lead man, broad-shouldered, a scar bisecting one eyebrow, studied Clay and the assembly standing behind him with the first flicker of uncertainty Amber had seen from any of them. "We're just here for a conversation," the man said. "Nothing that concerns you. Everything on this property concerns me," Clay said. "And I'm guessing the conversation we're looking for involves a woman who doesn't want to have it. So here's your choice. Leave right now, quiet, no trouble, or find out exactly what it means to threaten someone standing on land protected by 3 charters instead of 1. The standoff stretched. A long, breathless moment of coiled tension. Then sirens. Multiple sets. Growing louder. Closing fast. Rose's call to the sheriff, paying off with a speed that suggested the ongoing fraud investigation into Mercer Holdings had already put local law enforcement on high alert for exactly this kind of escalation. The lead man's eyes tracked toward the sound, something shifting in his calculation, weighing the job against the very real possibility of arrest. "This isn't over," he said, echoing words Amber had heard from Nathan himself weeks earlier, and something in the repetition almost made her laugh. Despite everything, the trucks pulled away moments before the first sheriff's cruiser rounded the bend. Amber watched from the window as Clay stood at the gate, unmoving, until the last set of tail lights dissolved into the darkness. The sheriff's department took statements for nearly 3 hours at night, from Clay, from Amber, from Grissom, whose defection had transformed him from a threat into, improbably, one of the most valuable witnesses in what was rapidly becoming the largest financial fraud case the region had seen in a decade. By morning, federal agents had arrived, drawn by the scale of Grissom's documentation and the attempted intimidation that had unfolded at Steel Haven's gates overnight. Amber sat across from 2 FBI agents in Clay's office and walked them through 3 months of discoveries, the forged vehicle transfers, the discontinued environmental forms, the planted employee, all of it converging into a single, comprehensive portrait of a criminal enterprise that had operated in the shadows for years. "Miss Collins," one of the agents said, reviewing her materials with visible respect, "I want to be direct with you. What you've assembled here, combined with what Mr. Grissom has provided, gives us more than enough to pursue federal charges against Nathan Mercer. Not just fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and depending on how last night's events are characterized, potentially witness intimidation and conspiracy to commit assault." "What happens now?" Amber asked. "We move fast," the agent said. "Given last night's escalation, we believe Mercer may attempt to flee or destroy evidence. We'll be seeking an arrest warrant within the next 48 hours. Amber sat with that for a long moment, trying to process the strange, disorienting relief of hearing that the man who had haunted every corner of her life for 4 years might finally face consequences no amount of money could erase. "I need you to understand something," the second agent added gently. "Cases like this take time to fully resolve. There will be a trial. You'll likely need to testify. This isn't finished today, even with an arrest." "I understand," Amber said. "I'm not asking for it to be over today. I'm just asking for it to actually end, eventually, permanently." The agent nodded, something like genuine sympathy crossing her professional expression. "Based on what you and your colleagues have built here," she said, "I think that's exactly what's coming." The arrest happened 2 days later. Amber learned about it not from news alerts, Not from a phone call from investigators, but from Rosa bursting into the trailer with her phone held out, tears already streaming freely down her face. "It's done," Rosa said, breathless. "They got him just now. Live on local news. They arrested him walking out of his own building." Amber took the phone with trembling hands, watching grainy footage of Nathan Mercer, her Nathan, the man who had controlled every dimension of her existence for 4 years, who had hunted her across state lines with money and lawyers, and hired intimidation, being walked out of his own building in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled, his face contorted with a fury that, for the first time in Amber's memory, held absolutely no power over her at all. She watched the footage twice, then a third time, waiting to feel something familiar, fear, maybe, or the old instinct to make herself smaller. Instead, what rose in her chest was something she hadn't anticipated. Grief. Not for Nathan. For the 4 years she'd spent believing she deserved nothing better than what he'd given her. Clay found her sitting alone in the trailer 20 minutes later, phone still in her hands, tears falling freely down her face. "You okay?" he asked gently, settling into the chair across from her. "I don't know how to feel," Amber admitted. "I thought I'd feel triumphant, relieved. I feel," she searched for the word, "sad." "Which doesn't make any sense." "Makes plenty of sense," Clay said quietly. "You're not grieving him. You're grieving the years you spent convinced you had to survive him instead of just living your life." He paused, letting that settle. "That's not weakness, Amber. That's just what healing looks like sometimes. Messier than anyone expects." Amber looked up at him. This man who had given her a chance nobody else would have, who had risked his business and his safety without a moment's hesitation, who had never once asked what she could offer in return. "Clay," she said quietly, "why did you help me, really? From the very first day. You didn't know me. You had no reason to risk everything you'd built for a stranger with $40. Clay considered the question for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful in the trailer's dim light. "Because somebody did it for me once," he said finally. "Long time ago. Before this club. Before this yard. When I was young and running from things I don't talk about much. Somebody gave me a chance nobody else would. No questions asked. No strings attached." He met her eyes, something quietly resolute in his expression. "I promised myself that if I ever got the chance to pay that forward, I would. You walked through that gate looking exactly like I did 30 years ago. Scared, desperate, certain the whole world had already decided who you were." He shook his head slowly. "Wasn't a hard decision, Amber. Wasn't really a decision at all. Just felt like the only right thing to do." Amber didn't trust her voice. She let the weight of his words settle into the empty spaces inside her that 4 years of fear had hollowed out. Outside, the yard continued its familiar rhythm. Engines growling, metal grinding, Deacon's laugh carrying across the open air. He worked on a bike that would probably never actually run. The ordinary, unremarkable sounds of a life continuing forward, unbothered by everything that had almost destroyed it. Amber stood slowly, wiping the last of her tears away, and looked out the trailer window at the yard that had become, against every possible expectation, her home. "What happens now?" she asked. Clay's answer came without hesitation, steady and certain in a way that finally, truly let something inside her rest. "Now," he said, "you get to actually live, however that looks, whatever that means. Nobody's controlling that but you. Living," Amber discovered in the weeks that followed, was harder than surviving had ever been. Survival had rules. Survival had a rhythm she'd memorized over 4 years. Anticipate, minimize, absorb, endure. Living had no rules at all. And that terrified her in ways Nathan's threats never quite had. Because with Nathan, she'd at least known exactly what she was up against. She was sitting in the trailer on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after his arrest, staring at a stack of paperwork she'd already organized twice, when Rosa knocked on the door frame. "Federal prosecutor's office called the front line," Rosa said. "They want you downtown Thursday. Pre-trial prep." Amber's stomach tightened, the old reflex kicking in before she could intercept it. Did they say what specifically? Just that they need to go over your testimony. Practice runs before it goes before a jury. Rosa hesitated. You want me to come with you? I'll be fine, Amber said, though the words came out thinner than she intended. She wasn't fine. She knew it the moment she walked into the federal building 3 days later, past security checkpoints and hallways that smelled like old coffee and fluorescent light, into a conference room where a sharp-eyed prosecutor named Diane Whitcomb sat waiting with 3 thick binders, and the expression of someone who had spent the past several weeks living inside the details of Amber's marriage more thoroughly than Amber herself had ever wanted anyone to. Miss Collins, Whitcomb said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Thank you for coming in. I know this isn't easy. It's fine, Amber said again, the automatic deflection surfacing before she could catch it. Whitcomb studied her for a moment, something knowing in her gaze. It's not fine. It's testimony about years of abuse, financial control, and fraud against a man who's going to have very expensive attorneys trying to make you look unreliable, unstable, or vindictive on the stand. It's allowed to not be fine, Miss Collins. What matters is whether you're ready for it anyway. Amber sat with that for a long moment. I don't know if I'm ready, she admitted. I don't know what ready even looks like for something like this. Nobody does the first time, Whitcomb said. That's why we practice. They spent 4 hours walking through the timeline, the marriage, the broken wrist, the night she left, the months of hunting, the fraud, the intimidation, the standoff at Steel Haven's gate. Whitcomb pushed relentlessly, playing devil's advocate with a coldness that left Amber shaking by the end, forcing her through the brutal questions Nathan's defense attorney would eventually ask in front of a jury. Why didn't you leave sooner? Why didn't you report the injury at the time? Why should this court believe your account over a respected businessman's? By the time Amber left the federal building that evening, she felt scraped hollow in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of her worst days with Nathan. She sat in her car in the parking garage for nearly 20 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. Hands trembling against the steering wheel, her phone buzzed. A text from Clay. How did it go? She stared at the question for a long moment, then typed back, harder than I expected. The response came almost immediately. You don't have to do this alone. Come home. We'll talk. Home. The word landed differently than it ever had before, and Amber found herself crying in a parking garage 3 counties from Steel Haven. Not from sadness exactly, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of having somewhere that word actually applied to. Clay was waiting at the gate when she arrived, along with Rosa, Deacon, and Big Sam, all of them gathered with the kind of casual loitering that Amber now recognized as deliberate support disguised as coincidence. You didn't have to wait up, she said, climbing out of her car. Wasn't waiting up, Deacon said, entirely unconvincingly, tightening a bolt on a bike that had been finished for a week. Amber managed a small, tired laugh. Clay fell into step beside her as she walked toward the trailer, his presence steady and grounding in the way it had become over the past 4 months. Talk to me, he said. She told him everything. Whitcomb's relentless questioning, the exhausting, humiliating rehearsal of the worst moments of her life, the fear of standing before a jury while Nathan's lawyers picked apart every choice she'd made trying to survive him. They're going to make it sound like I could have left sooner, she said, her voice cracking. Like the fact that I didn't call the police after he broke my wrist means it didn't really happen the way I said. Like 4 years of staying somehow proves he's innocent instead of proving how skilled he was at making sure I couldn't leave. Clay stopped walking, turning to face her fully. You know why people stay, he said, because leaving isn't a door that just opens. It's something you have to build, piece by piece, sometimes over years, especially when the person controlling you has money and lawyers, and every institution designed to make leaving harder than staying. He paused, jaw tight. Anybody who's lived it understands that. Anybody who hasn't, their opinion doesn't deserve the weight you're giving it. The jury's opinion matters, Amber said quietly. That's the whole problem. Then we make sure they understand, Clay said, Same way we made sure that task force understood. Same way we made sure Nathan understood. Standing at that gate, he looked at her steadily. You're not walking into that courtroom alone, Amber. Not for one single minute of it. The weeks leading up to the trial passed in a strange blend of mundane routine and mounting dread. Amber continued her work at Steel Haven. The yard had grown in the months since the fraud investigation went public, drawing attention from local news outlets covering the story of a scrapyard that had helped unravel a multi-county money laundering scheme. New customers arrived daily, some out of curiosity, most out of the genuine respect that comes from watching a business survive an attack that would have destroyed a lesser operation. Amber found herself, almost without realizing it, becoming something more than the yard's records manager. Word had spread, first locally, and then further, about the woman at Steel Haven who had helped expose a massive fraud scheme while simultaneously escaping an abusive marriage. She began receiving calls, tentative and quiet, from other women in similar situations. A woman named Patricia, hiding from a controlling husband 3 towns over, needing help untangling financial records he'd made deliberately incomprehensible. A young mother named Teresa, whose ex had frozen her accounts the same way Nathan had frozen Amber's, needing someone who understood both the paperwork and the fear well enough to help her navigate both at once. Amber helped each of them without hesitation, staying late in the trailer some nights, walking strangers through the same process that had once saved her own life, untangling lies hidden inside legitimate-looking paperwork, finding the threads that proved manipulation other than accident, building the kind of ironclad documentation that couldn't be argued away by expensive lawyers. Clay watched this transformation unfold with quiet approval, never commenting directly, but making sure the trailer's hours stayed flexible, that the yard's resources were available whenever Amber needed them for the growing, informal network of women finding their way to Steel Haven's gates. You're building something, he said to her one evening, watching her walk a shaking, frightened woman named Diane back to her car after a 3-hour session untangling fraudulent loan documents her husband had forged in her name. I'm just helping, Amber said. That's what building something looks like, Clay said. Most people don't recognize it while they're doing it. The trial began on a grey Monday morning in early autumn, 6 months after Nathan's arrest, in a federal courthouse that felt to Amber cavernous and cold in a way that made her chest tighten from the moment she walked through its doors. Clay sat directly behind her in the gallery, alongside Rosa, Deacon, Big Sam, and a dozen other members of Steel Haven and the neighboring charters who had, without being asked, taken time off work and ridden in from 3 different counties to fill the courtrooms, public seating with a wall of leather vests and unwavering presence. Nathan sat at the defense table in a suit that looked less expensive than the ones Amber remembered. His face had gone gaunt in a way that suggested the past 6 months had cost him more than just money. His eyes found her once, briefly, as she took her seat, and Amber forced herself to hold his gaze for exactly 3 seconds before looking deliberately away. Not from fear this time, from the simple, deliberate choice not to give him more of her attention than he deserved. The prosecution's case unfolded over 4 days, methodical and devastating. Whitcomb walked the jury through the fraud scheme with surgical precision. The laundered vehicles, the planted employee, the falsified environmental filings, the state grant fraudulently obtained to fund a task force designed to harass and intimidate. Grissom testified for nearly 6 hours, his voice steady despite the visible toll the entire ordeal had taken on him, laying out 8 months of documentation that painted an unambiguous picture of a criminal enterprise operating in the shadows 4 years. Then on the 5th day, it was Amber's turn. She walked to the witness stand with her legs trembling beneath her, but her spine straight, her chin level, refusing to let the fear show in her posture, even as it screamed through every nerve in her body. Whitcomb's questions came gently at first, walking her through the timeline of the marriage, The gradual erosion of her independence, the broken wrist. The night she finally left. Can you describe for the jury what happened the night your wrist was broken? Amber's voice shook as she spoke, but she didn't stop, and she didn't soften the details the way 4 years of training had taught her to do for Nathan's comfort. She described the argument, the moment he had grabbed her arm to stop her from leaving the room, the sound the bone had made, the emergency room visit where she told the doctor she'd fallen because Nathan had been standing close enough behind her the entire time that she hadn't dared say anything else. She watched several jurors' expressions tighten as she spoke, watched one older woman near the back dab quietly at her eyes, and something in Amber's chest loosened, the terrifying vulnerability of finally being believed settling into her like a long overdue exhale. Then came the cross-examination. Nathan's attorney, a sharp, aggressive man named Fenwick, who had clearly built his career on exactly this kind of dismantling, rose from his seat with the practiced confidence of a predator who had done this 100 times before. Miss Collins, Fenwick began, you testified that this alleged incident occurred 4 years ago. Correct? Yes. And you never reported it to police? No. You never sought a restraining order? No. In fact, you remained married to Mr. Mercer for nearly a full year after this alleged incident. Is that correct? Yes, Amber said, the old shame trying to claw its way back up her throat. Doesn't that seem inconsistent, Miss Collins, with someone who genuinely believed her husband had violently broken her wrist? Whitcomb rose immediately. Objection. Argumentative. I'll allow the witness to answer, the judge said. Amber sat with the question for a moment, feeling every eye in the courtroom on her, feeling Nathan's gaze burning into her from the defense table, feeling 4 years of carefully cultivated shame trying to reclaim territory it had lost. Then she thought about Clay sitting directly behind her. She thought about the day he'd told her that leaving wasn't a door that opens all at once. It's something built piece by piece. She thought about Patricia and Teresa and Diane, all the women who had walked into the trailer carrying the same shame Fenwick was trying to weaponize against her right now. It doesn't seem inconsistent to me, Amber said, her voice steadying with each word, because I understand something Mr. Fenwick apparently doesn't. She held his gaze. Staying isn't proof that abuse didn't happen. Staying is what abuse trains you to do. Nathan controlled every account in our marriage. He controlled which friends I was allowed to maintain, which family members I could visit without supervision, how much money I could access on any given day. Leaving a man like that isn't a single decision you make in a moment of clarity. It's a process you survive long enough to eventually escape. If you're lucky enough, and brave enough, and desperate enough to finally accept the risk. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Fenwick's confident posture had faltered, clearly not expecting this level of composed, articulate resistance. I stayed for a year after my wrist was broken, Amber continued, before he could interrupt, because I believed, the way he'd spent years training me to believe, that leaving would be more dangerous than staying. I stayed because I had no independent income, no support network, and a husband who had made very sure I understood exactly how alone I'd be if I ever tried to walk away. Her voice cracked just slightly, but she pushed through it. I left the second time I found the courage, not because the danger had changed, but because I had finally accumulated enough strength to accept that danger existed either way, and to choose the version of it that led somewhere better. The older juror near the back was openly crying now. Fenwick stood frozen for a long moment, visibly recalculating his approach, before retreating to a different line of questioning entirely. Amber left the witness stand 2 hours later, her whole body trembling with exhaustion, but something inside her had shifted permanently in a way she could feel all the way into her bones. She had said the words aloud, in front of a jury, in front of Nathan himself, without flinching, without softening them for anyone else's comfort. She had finally, completely, told the truth. The trial stretched across 3 grueling weeks. The prosecution methodically dismantled Every layer of Nathan's criminal enterprise, financial, expert after financial expert walking, the jury through wire transfers, shell companies, and forged documents that painted an increasingly damning picture no amount of expensive legal maneuvering could fully obscure. Nathan's defense felt thin and desperate by comparison. Character witnesses who painted him as a respected businessman victimized by a runaway wife and opportunistic bikers looking to profit from chaos. An argument that grew visibly weaker each time it collided with the mountain of documented evidence Amber, Grissom, and the financial forensics team had assembled. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Amber sat in the courthouse hallway during those hours, flanked by Clay on one side and Rosa on the other, unable to eat, barely able to speak, her mind cycling through every possible outcome with the exhausted, repetitive dread of someone who has learned that the worst outcome is always within reach. What if the jury didn't believe her? What if Nathan's money bought enough reasonable doubt? What if 4 years of surviving him ended in a verdict that told her definitively that none of it had mattered? Whatever happens in there, Clay said quietly, breaking the silence, doesn't change what already happened out here. What do you mean? I mean you already won, Amber. His voice was steady and certain. The moment you walked into that yard 3 months before any of this trial started and decided you weren't going to disappear just because he wanted you to. The moment you looked at that jury and told the truth without flinching, even when his lawyer tried to make you feel small for it, that's the win. Whatever 12 strangers decide in that room doesn't take that away from you. Amber let the words settle over her, feeling something steady beneath the terror, something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like genuine peace rather than the fragile, manufactured calm she'd learned to sustain just to get through each day. The bailiff called them back into the courtroom at 6:47 in the evening. The jury foreman stood, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a steady voice, and read the verdict into a silence so complete Amber could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Guilty on every count: fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, witness intimidation. The words seemed to hang suspended in the air before they finally landed, and something broke open inside Amber's chest. Not grief this time, not the complicated sorrow she'd felt watching his arrest on television months earlier. Something closer to release. 4 years of fear, of small, careful movements designed to minimize his anger, of believing she deserved nothing better than what he'd given her. All of it finally, irrevocably validated as the injustice it had always been. She didn't look at Nathan as the verdict was read. She didn't need to anymore. Behind her she heard Rose's quiet sob, felt Clay's hand land steady on her shoulder, heard the low murmur of relief rippling through the row of leather-clad supporters who had shown up every single day of this trial, without being asked, without expecting anything in return, to stand beside someone who needed them. The judge scheduled sentencing 6 weeks later. Given the scope of the financial crimes, given the witness intimidation charges, given the sheer scale of the enterprise Nathan had built and maintained, 4 years, the prosecution indicated they'd be seeking a sentence that would keep him incarcerated for well over a decade. Amber walked out of that courthouse into the cool autumn evening air, surrounded by the people who had become her family in ways blood never had, and allowed herself, for the first time in 4 years, to simply breathe without calculating the cost of it. Sentencing came and went. 14 years. The judge's voice flat and final as he read the terms into the record. More time than even the prosecution had initially projected. A direct result of the witness intimidation charges stemming from the night trucks full of hired men had pulled up to Steel Haven's gate with intentions that never got the chance to unfold. Nathan didn't look at her as they led him away in handcuffs for the final time. Amber found she didn't need him to. Steel Haven, meanwhile, had transformed into something Clay could never have predicted the day Amber first walked through its gate with $40 and a backpack. The publicity from the trial, combined with the genuine respect the community had developed for a business that had weathered an attack of this magnitude without buckling, had turned the Yard into something of a local institution. New contracts arrived steadily. The workforce doubled. Clay, ever practical, used the increased revenue to expand the trailer into an actual office building, proper heating, a computer system that didn't threaten to collapse every third use, a sign out front that finally reflected the operation running behind it. But it was the informal network Amber had built almost accidentally. Women arriving quietly at Steel Haven's gates, seeking help untangling financial abuse, escaping controlling relationships, rebuilding lives that men like Nathan had spent years systematically dismantling. That became, in many ways, the Yard's true legacy. Clay formalized it eventually. 6 months after the trial ended, he called Amber into his office on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. "I want to talk about something," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "That's never good," Amber said, though she was smiling as she sat. "It's good," Clay said. "I've been thinking about what you've built here, not the filing system. Though that's saved this business more money than I can count. I mean the other thing. The women who keep showing up at that gate." Amber's expression softened. "I never planned for that to happen. It just did. Would spread. People needed help." "I know," Clay said. "That's exactly why I think we should make it official. A real program. Legal aid partnerships, financial counseling, transitional housing eventually. If the club can pull together the resources." He paused, studying her carefully. "I want you running it." Amber sat back in her chair, stunned into silence. "Clay, I'm not a social worker. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have any formal training for something like this." "You've got something better," Clay said. "You've lived it. Every woman who's walked through that gate in the last 6 months has trusted you specifically because you understand exactly what they're carrying, in a way no certification in the world could teach. Somebody." He leaned forward. "I've watched you rebuild a fraud case that took down a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. I've watched you testify in federal court without flinching, in front of the man who spent 4 years trying to convince you that you were nothing without him. I think you can figure out how to run a support program, Amber." He paused. "I think you've already been running one. We're just talking about making it official." Something rose in Amber's chest, warm and unfamiliar, and entirely welcome. Not the fragile, desperate hope she'd carried walking through that gate the first time. Something sturdier, something that felt like the foundation of an actual future, rather than a temporary refuge from the past. "Okay," she said, her voice steady, certain in a way it hadn't been in years. "Let's build it." A year later, on a warm afternoon in late spring, Amber stood at the edge of Steel Haven's yard, watching a woman named Carol Finn, exhausted, carrying a single suitcase, wearing an expression Amber recognized instantly because she'd worn it herself once, walk hesitantly through the front gate. Deacon was the one who greeted her first. The same careful assessment he'd once given Amber, though his approach now carried a gentleness that had grown alongside the program's success. He led Carol toward the office building, no longer a crumbling trailer, but a proper structure with a sign reading Steel Haven Outreach, funded partly by the Yard's growing revenue and partly by grants Amber had spent months learning to write, applying the same meticulous, detail-oriented skill she'd once used to catch Nathan's fraud toward securing resources for women just like herself. Amber watched the interaction from a distance, feeling the familiar pull of recognition, the echo of her own first terrified steps through this same gate. Exactly 2 years earlier, Clay appeared beside her, following her gaze toward the new arrival. "Another one," he said. "Another one," Amber agreed. "Third this month." Word spreading, Amber said, and something in her voice carried a quiet, hard-won pride that had nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with purpose. "We got a call yesterday from a women's shelter to states over. They want to know if we'd consider consulting on setting up something similar in their region." Clay's weathered face broke into the rare, Genuine smile Amber had come to treasure over the past 2 years. What did you tell them? I told them yes, Amber said. Told them I'd need about a month to put together training materials. But yes, they stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Carol disappear into the office building, watching Rosa emerge with a warm cup of coffee already prepared, watching the yard continue its familiar rhythm around them, engines growling, metal grinding, the ordinary, unremarkable sounds of a life that had absorbed tragedy and transformed it into something that helped instead of harmed. You ever think about it? Clay asked. The day you drove through that gate. $40, one backpack, running from a man who wanted to own you. Every day, Amber admitted. I think about how close I came to driving past. How many times I almost turned around before I got out of the car. What stopped you? Amber considered the question for a long moment, watching the yard she'd once believed was the last resort of a desperate woman with nowhere else to go. Understanding now that it had never been a last resort at all. I stopped being afraid of the wrong things, she said finally. I spent 4 years afraid of a man who wanted to control me. I almost let that fear keep me from walking through a gate that led to the first place that ever let me be free. Clay nodded slowly, something quietly proud settling into his weathered features. Best decision this yard ever made, he said. Letting you through that gate. Best decision I ever made, Amber said, walking through it. Behind them, Carol's nervous laughter drifted from the office building. Rose's doing, no doubt, the same warmth that had welcomed Amber now extending outward to every frightened woman who found her way to Steel Haven's gate. The sound carried across the yard, mixing with engine noise and distant conversation, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. Amber Collins had arrived at Steel Haven Salvage 2 years earlier, believing she had accepted the worst job in America. Filthy work, dangerous work, the last resort of a woman with nothing left to lose. She understood now, standing in the golden afternoon light, watching a new arrival take her first tentative steps toward healing, in the exact place Amber had once taken her own, that she had never accepted a last resort at all. She had found the first place in her entire adult life that never once tried to own her, and in that discovery, in the family built not from blood, but from loyalty, in the strength she'd rediscovered buried beneath years of careful erosion, in the purpose she'd built from the wreckage of everything Nathan Mercer had tried to destroy. Amber Collins had found something far more valuable than safety alone. She had found herself, completely, permanently, and nothing would ever take that away from her again.